Jesus chose a donkey, not a horse. Every king in the 1st century who entered a capital city rode a war horse. Pilate himself had ridden into Jerusalem days earlier from Caesarea Maritima on one, flanked by auxiliary cavalry, iron on stone, the sound of empire arriving. A Messiah on a horse was what Israel had been waiting for since the Maccabees had driven the Seleucids out almost 200 years before. And here, on a spring morning outside Bethany, a young colt that had never been ridden stood tethered to a post, and Jesus sent 2 of those who followed him to untie it. The crowd saw what they wanted to see. He was doing something else entirely. Zechariah had written it 500 years earlier, in chapter 9, verse 9. "Behold, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Almost no one in the crowd that morning was thinking about Zechariah. They were thinking about Rome. 3 things will come clear before this is finished. The first is what the crowd was actually shouting when they cried, "Hosanna," because the word does not mean what most translations let you believe. The second is why the men who hated him understood him more soberly that morning than the men who were waving branches for him. The third is what shifted in 5 days. What specifically the people of Jerusalem learned about him between Sunday and Friday that turned their mouths from praise into a verdict. For anyone who wants the texts read slowly, without hurry, without shortcut, this is where that work lives. Subscribe and stay with it. The road from Bethany climbs the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives and then drops toward the Kidron Valley, and from that ridge the whole city opens. The Temple Mount gleaming in April light, the limestone walls pale against the sky. Pilgrims are already on the road for Passover. Josephus recorded, in the 1st century, that Jerusalem at that festival swelled to numbers the narrow streets could not hold. Cloaks come off shoulders and fall into the dust. Palm branches, cut fresh, release that green, slightly bitter smell when they are broken. Feet press them flat. The colt moves slowly under him, unhurried, its small hooves finding the stones. And above the noise of the throng, he rides, silent, steady, toward a city that is about to misunderstand him completely. They saw a conqueror. He came as something else. And within 5 days, the distance between what they wanted and what he was would become the distance between Hosanna and a verdict spoken out loud. Listen to the word itself. Hosanna. In English, it lands like applause, a festive syllable, almost ornamental, the sort of thing printed on banners and sung in choirs. That is not what it meant in the mouths of the people lining the road that Sunday. Matthew, writing in Greek in chapter 21, verse 9, preserved the Aramaic underneath in transliteration, Hosanna, because he knew his readers needed to hear the original sound. Beneath the Greek letters sits the Hebrew imperative from Psalm 118, verse 25, Hoshiana. Save, please, save us, now. It is not praise, it is a plea. The psalm it comes from was sung by pilgrims climbing toward the temple at every major festival, a processional prayer for rescue. So when they tore branches from the date palms lining the road and spread their outer cloaks across the stones, they were not congratulating him. They were begging him. The distinction matters more than almost any other detail in this scene. A crowd that praises a man is a crowd that admires him from a distance. A crowd that cries, "Save us," has already decided what it wants saved from, and has already decided he is the one who will do it. Save us from Rome. Save us from the soldiers who confiscated grain last harvest. Save us from the taxes that emptied the villages. Save us from Pilate, whose cavalry had passed through these same gates days before. The shout rising around the colt was political before it was anything else, and here is the weight that sits underneath it. A cry for rescue is the most vulnerable thing a human mouth can form. If you have ever prayed the same petition for 3 years and stopped expecting an answer, you know what it costs to open your throat and ask out loud one more time. You know the exposure of it. The crowd that morning was doing exactly that. on a public road, in daylight, in front of Roman informants. They were not performing, they were asking, with the specific desperation of people who had run out of other options. The tragedy is not that they asked. The tragedy is what they thought rescue would look like. They were picturing a throne in Jerusalem and legions driven back to the coast. He was riding toward a cross outside the city wall. Both of them used the same word for salvation. Neither of them meant the same thing by it. And when it became clear, over the coming days, that his idea of saving them did not include what they had asked to be saved from, the word in their mouths would begin to sour. The plea was real, the misunderstanding was total, and misunderstood pleas, when they go unanswered in the form they were asked, rarely stay pleas for long. Stand off the road for a moment, step into the shade behind the palm sellers, and watch the faces at the edge of the procession, the ones not shouting. A small cluster of Pharisees has gathered where the road narrows, robes brushed clean, phylacteries tight against the forehead, eyes tracking the colt as it passes. John preserved what they said to one another, almost under their breath, in chapter 12, verse 19. See how you are accomplishing nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. It is one of the strangest sentences in the Gospels. It is an admission of defeat, spoken by the men who will hand him over to Rome within the week. And it is spoken without celebration. These were not fools. The Pharisees of the first century were the most literate men in Judea, trained in Torah from childhood, schooled in the prophets, many of them able to recite entire books from memory. They had read Zechariah. They knew what a king on a donkey meant. They could see, more clearly than anyone waving a branch, that the man on that colt was not staging a revolt against Rome. He was staging a claim far older and far harder to answer. And they could see what no one in the middle of the crowd could see, because the crowd was inside itself. They could see where this was going. Pilate would have informants on this road by noon. Caiaphas would hear of it before the sun set. A Galilean teacher entering the capital during Passover week, with a throng shouting a psalm of deliverance over him, was the exact configuration Rome crushed without hesitation. Josephus recorded in the first century dozens of smaller messianic stirrings put down with crucifixions in rows along the roads. The Pharisees had watched it happen before. They knew what the soldiers would do, and there is something that deserves to be said here, carefully. The men who are often painted as the villains of this scene were, in this particular moment, the only ones seeing it soberly. They were mistaken on almost everything that mattered, about him, about what he came to do, about what his death would mean. But on the political reading of that Sunday morning, they were clearer than the crowd that loved him. That is an uncomfortable thing to sit with. Sometimes the people who recognize the danger of a moment are not the people closest to God in it. Sometimes clarity and worship come apart. You may know this from your own life, standing in a church while something in you watches from the edge, counting exits, unable to sing. That kind of sobriety is not a sign of unbelief. It can be the exact thing that will keep you in the room long after the noise has moved on. The crowd kept shouting. The Pharisees kept whispering. And between those two sounds, the man on the colt rode steadily into a city where both groups would, before the week ended, be standing in the same courtyard, watching the same trial, and answering the same question, each in their own way. And then, at the bend in the road where the descent begins and the whole city comes into view across the Kidron, he stops. Luke recorded it in chapter 19, verses 41 through 44. When he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. The Greek word Luke chose is eklauson, not a quiet moistening of the eyes, but audible weeping, the kind of sound that rises from the chest. The same verb he used later for Peter after the rooster crowed. Picture what this looks like from the inside of the procession, branches still in motion above heads, the psalm of deliverance still rising behind him, cloaks still soft under the colt's hooves, and the man at the center of it has tears on his face. No one knows what to do with that. You cannot plan for a king who arrives weeping at his own coronation. What Luke preserved next makes it heavier. If you had known, even you, on this day, the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will dash you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. He was describing in specific detail the Roman siege of 70 AD, 40 years before it happened. Josephus would later record that the general Titus ordered exactly such an embankment around Jerusalem, that the walls came down stone by stone, that the temple itself was raised. Jesus was seeing it, while they cheered. This is one of the loneliest sentences in the Gospels. He was surrounded, adored, lifted up on the noise of thousands, and entirely alone inside what he knew. Grief in the middle of celebration is one of the most isolating experiences a human being can carry. You know this if you have ever sat at a wedding or a birthday or a holiday table while something inside you was breaking that no one else could see. You smiled when smiling was required. You lifted the glass. And some part of you stayed outside the room, watching the people you loved from behind glass, unable to tell them what was actually happening. That is where he was on that ridge. Except what he was seeing was not his own grief, it was theirs. The children playing in the streets below, the mothers who would be inside those walls when the legions came. The very people shouting for rescue were the ones he was weeping over, because he could see that they were asking to be saved from the wrong thing. He did not stop weeping and then enter the city composed. Luke gives no such transition. The tears and the ride continue together. He wept and kept going. That is the thing almost no one notices. He did not turn the colt around. He did not wait for the crowd to understand. He rode toward them with his face still wet, toward a week that would require him to love people who were, at that very moment, about to change their minds about him. And somewhere in the distance, inside the gates he was approaching, the tables of the money changers stood exactly where they had stood for years, and he had already decided what he was going to do when he reached them. Monday morning, the day after the colt. The outer court of the temple is already alive by the third hour. The clink of coins, the smell of livestock, the low rumble of bargaining in 3 languages. Jewish pilgrims from the diaspora are changing their Roman denarii into Tyrian shekels, the only currency the temple accepted. Doves in wicker cages stacked along the colonnade, the air thick with feathers and droppings and the sharp copper smell of money handled too many times. And then Jesus walks in. Matthew preserved it in chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. He overturned the tables. He drove them out. He scattered the coins across the flagstones. "My house shall be called a house of petition," he declared, "but you have made it a den of thieves." Understand what this actually was. The money changers did not operate on the margins of the temple economy. They were the economy. They took a percentage from every pilgrim. The dove sellers sold the offering required of the poor for their purification, and many families in Jerusalem ate that week because of the commerce in those courts. When the tables went over, coins rolling across stone, cages tipped, doves flapping loose into the upper colonnade, it was not a symbolic gesture. It was an attack on the livelihood of the city. Word traveled fast. By Tuesday, people were asking a different question than they had asked on Sunday. On Sunday, they had asked whether he would save them. By Tuesday, they were asking, what kind of savior dismantles the thing that feeds you? And then came his teaching through the week, recorded across Matthew 21, 22, 23, and into the long discourse of chapter 24. Pay taxes to Caesar. Love your enemies. The first will be last. My kingdom is not of this world. Every sentence was another door closing on what they had hoped he was. They had shouted, "Save us from Rome." He was telling them to pay their taxes to Rome. They had wanted a throne in Jerusalem. He was speaking about a kingdom they could not see. If you have watched a relationship end, not in a single moment, but across a week of small disappointments, each one alone survivable, the sum of them unsurvivable, you know the shape of what happened in the city that week. It was not one event, it was an accumulation. Every day they learned something new about him that did not match the man they had been waiting for. By Thursday night, many of them were no longer sure what they had cheered for on Sunday. By Friday morning, when the priests moved among them in the courtyard of Pilate and offered them a name to shout instead, the door had already been opened by 5 days of quiet, private disillusionment. They did not turn because they were evil. They turned because the man they had wanted was not the man who had come. And the question of whether it was the same crowd on both mornings was about to be answered by a Greek word the Gospel writers chose very deliberately, a word that explains, better than any other, why a human being can mean two opposite things in the same week and not remember the contradiction. The word is ochlos. Matthew uses it in chapter 21, verse 8, when the throng spreads its garments on the road. He uses it again in chapter 27, verse 20, when the chief priests persuaded the throng to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The same Greek word, both mornings. This matters because Greek had other options, and the Gospel writers knew them. Ecclesia, an assembly called out for a common purpose. That word would become, by the 2nd century, the standard term for the church. Laos, a people, a nation, bound by shared identity and shared memory. That is the word the Septuagint uses for Israel as a covenant people. Ochlos is neither of these. Ochlos means a mass of human beings who happen to be in the same place at the same time. No shared purpose, no shared identity, no structure of leadership that speaks for the whole. A market crowd, a stadium crowd, the gathering that forms when something happens on a street corner and dissolves when the thing is over. Matthew reached for that word deliberately, because an ochlos does not carry a memory across 5 days. It cannot. It has no spine to carry one on. The individuals inside it may remember. A woman who saw the colt on Sunday may remember it perfectly on Friday, but she is not standing among the same people. The shape around her has reformed, different faces at her shoulder, a different mood in the air, a different voice giving her a word to shout. John Chrysostom, preaching in Antioch at the end of the 4th century, observed something close to this, that the multitude is moved more by the last voice it hears than by the last thing it believed. He was naming what Matthew had already shown by word choice, something to hold still with here. The same man who shouted Hosanna on Sunday could have shouted Crucify on Friday and not experienced himself as a traitor. Inside his own head, each moment felt coherent. On Sunday, he was part of a wave that believed. On Friday, he was part of the wave that had been corrected. The crowd that loved him and the crowd that demanded him dead were not different populations, but they were not the same entity either. They were two ochloi, assembled from overlapping material, with no thread of shared memory between them. This is the terrifying architecture of collective life. You can stand inside a room full of people agreeing about something, and 5 days later, stand inside a different room, full of many of the same people agreeing about the opposite, and feel no contradiction, because the room is doing the thinking. There is someone listening to this right now who has been in that room. You know the moment when a conversation at a table turns and suddenly everyone is saying something you would not have said alone, and your own mouth is moving too. And afterwards, driving home, you cannot quite reconstruct how you ended up there. That is ochlos. It is not a moral failing. It is a structural feature of being human in a group. And it is the reason the Gospels are so careful, in the Passion narrative, to name individuals by name. Peter, Joseph of Arimathea, the centurion, the women at the cross. Because individuals carry memory. Crowds do not. Which means that what happened on Friday morning required, in addition to the throng, something else. A specific legal phrase, spoken out loud, that bound the moment into history and would not let the throng forget what it had done. Friday morning, the governor's courtyard in front of the Antonia fortress. Pilate has a basin of water brought out and washes his hands in front of the throng. A Jewish ritual gesture he is borrowing awkwardly, knowing exactly what it signifies. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declares. "See to it yourselves." And Matthew records, in chapter 27, verse 25, the response. All the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." This sentence has been misread for most of its history. It is not a curse. It is not the throng consigning itself to condemnation. It is a specific legal formula from 1st century Jewish jurisprudence, a phrase used in court proceedings to transfer the culpability of a capital verdict from one party to another. When a judge issued a death sentence and there was dispute over responsibility, the party accepting the liability would pronounce the blood on themselves. It is in the Mishnah, in Deuteronomy 19 verses 10 and 13, in the procedures of the Sanhedrin. Pilate had placed culpability in the space between him and them. They picked it up. What they were saying, in the courtroom sense, was, "We accept the legal responsibility for this verdict." Augustine, writing from Hippo in North Africa in the early 5th century, insisted that this phrase had to be read inside its Jewish legal context, not as a metaphysical curse stretching across generations, but as a specific moment of ownership spoken in a specific courtyard. Chrysostom, in his homilies on Matthew delivered in Antioch in the late 4th century, went further. He warned his congregations not to use this verse as ammunition against the Jewish people, because what the throng was doing in that moment was what human beings do when a decision has already been made in their hearts and they need language to seal it. They were not speaking for their descendants. They were speaking for themselves, binding their own hands to what was about to happen in the only legal phrase available. And that is the moment the ophlos, which has no memory, tried to borrow one. A legal formula is a kind of artificial spine. It is what people reach for when they want a crowd decision to hold the weight of a real one. If you have ever said words out loud that you did not fully mean, in an argument, in a vow made too quickly, in a declaration spoken because everyone else was speaking, you know what happens next. The words outlive the moment. The mood that produced them passes. The sentence remains. That is where the throng stood that morning. They had spoken a formula whose legal force would echo long after the adrenaline of the courtyard had drained out of them. And somewhere in that same space, at the back of the throng, a man who had walked in loving Jesus may have opened his mouth too, said the phrase along with everyone else, and felt, for the first time in 5 days, the specific weight of what he had done. Which is the question the final chapter has to answer: how a human being lives after missing the moment that was already there. Go back to the ridge where he wept. Luke chapter 19, verse 44, the last phrase, "because you did not know the time of your visitation." The Greek word is episkope. It is not a passive word. It means the moment when someone in authority comes to inspect, to examine, to find out what is there. A landowner walking through the field at harvest, an overseer arriving at the house to see how the servants have managed. It is the same root that would later give the early church the word for bishop, episkopos, the one who comes to look. Jesus was telling Jerusalem that what had just passed through its gates was an episkope, the examination itself, and it was already over. Here are the 3 things I said at the beginning would come clear. The first was what Hosanna actually was, a plea from Psalm 118, verse 25, "Save us now," the most vulnerable word a human mouth can form, aimed at a rescue they had defined in advance. The second was why the Pharisees, in John 12, verse 19, saw the Sunday morning more soberly than anyone waving a branch, because clarity and worship can come apart, and sometimes the people who see the danger are not the people inside the song. The third was what shifted across 5 days. A temple court cleared of its tables, a kingdom that refused to match the shape they had wanted, a wave of small corrections that left them ready by Friday to accept a legal formula they did not fully understand. All 3 close on the same point. They missed him not because he was hidden, but because he did not match. The human ending of this belongs to one man whose name we know, Simon of Cyrene. Mark records, in chapter 15, verse 21, that he was pulled out of the throng on Friday morning and made to carry the crossbeam behind Jesus up to Golgotha. He had come to Jerusalem for Passover. He was a stranger in the city. Mark adds the detail that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, 2 names Mark's first readers in Rome evidently recognized, which means Simon's family had, by the time the Gospel was written, become part of the early church. One man pulled out of the okhlos by the shoulder, forced into contact with the specific weight of a specific cross, and the contact did not let him go. The crowd dissolved by nightfall. He did not. The throng has no memory. He became one. There is someone listening to this who has prayed the same petition for so long, the silence has stopped feeling like silence and started feeling like an answer of a kind you cannot name. There is someone here who is still showing up, the pew, the chair by the window, the words spoken into a room that gives nothing back, and wondering why it feels empty. There is someone carrying a child or a parent or a spouse whose life you cannot fix, and the carrying has become the whole shape of your day. There is someone who confessed a thing that was taken seriously and absolved, and who still cannot put it down. There is someone at 3 a.m. whose fears daylight does not manage. All 5 of you are asking, in some form, the same question the city at the ridge was asked: whether this is the hour of visitation, and whether it is possible to miss it without knowing. Here is what the story answers. The throng missed him because they wanted a different rescue. Simon met him because something forced his hands onto the specific weight that was actually there. You will not recognize the visitation by its size, or its volume, or its match to the prayer you wrote down 3 years ago. You will recognize it by its refusal to be what you ordered. The next time a day arrives that does not give you what you asked for, the diagnosis that did not reverse, the relationship that did not soften, the call that did not come. Hold the thought that the episcope may be inside that exact disappointment, not around it. Sit with it 1 minute longer than your instinct tells you to. That minute is the spine Ochlos does not have. Let us hold this together. Father, we come with the word of the city shouted at the gate. Hoshea na, save us now. And we admit we have often meant by it something you were not going to give. Forgive the rescues we wrote down in advance. Forgive the mornings we waved for a king and the afternoons we could not find him in what came instead. Teach us to recognize the hour of visitation when it arrives wearing a shape we would not have chosen. Give us the courage of Simon, whose hands were forced onto the real weight and who did not let go afterwards. When our own mouths move with the room and say what we would not have said alone, pull us out by the shoulder. And when we cannot feel you, let us stay in the courtyard 1 minute longer. Amen. Before you close this, one thing. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you. The tears on the ridge while the branches were still in motion, the overturned tables on Monday, and the question the city was asking by Tuesday, or the legal phrase in Pilate's courtyard spoken by people who had no idea what they were binding. One of them is sitting with you now. Name it. And if you want to stay with this kind of slow reading, the next study goes into the courtyard itself, into the specific words Peter said to a servant girl by a charcoal fire 3 times before the rooster, and what the Greek verb for denial actually meant in a first-century legal setting. It is not what most translations make it sound like. Stay with us.